Welcome to our new Leaders in Action series called Looking Ahead. I'm Bill Story of the Olderhood Group, and my guest today is Martha Harris Myron, who's a financial advisor and renowned author. Hi, Martha. How are you doing today?
I'm just great. How are you, Bill?
Thank you. I'm fine. So in this new series, the theme is financial planning for your future. So today, Martha, I think we're going to talk about pension planning. Making the right choices. So in other words, you've got a company. Well, hopefully, you have a company pension plan. You're putting in contributions, maybe 5% of your salary, and hopefully your employer is putting in the same amount. So if all of that works, that sounds like about 10% of your salary will be going into your employer's the pension plan from within your work. So that gets us started off. We've got the money going in to the pension plan, Martha. What are we going to do with it?
I want to mention two things just to start with, depending upon the jurisdiction that you're in. If you're watching this video, it may be 5% match from you and your employer. It may be less, and the match from your employer may only be on a voluntary basis. However, you need to congratulate yourself to start with that you're actually putting this money aside. So the second thing that comes into play is if you really are lucky enough to have a pension, let's say you're just starting in the workforce, the second challenge for you is to start to educate yourself as much as you can about investments. Now, one of the things that happened numerous times when over the years with the firm that I had and even practicing professionally after that was that we would make a presentation about pensions, and the employer would have a menu of pension choices that was given to the employer by a pension administrator on the choices that you could make. And individuals would say to me, I really don't know anything about mutual funds and that sort of thing. So I just picked one. That's not probably the greatest idea. At least it got you into the market and starting to invest with your pension. But what you need to think about are two things, which is where are you in the workforce and the stage? What stage are you at? And two, how do you feel about investment markets when you pick up the newspaper? So let's sort of take this in stages. Let's say you're a young person just heading into the workforce. You probably are going to have at least 40 years ahead of you. Can you imagine how much a pension will grow by then? And we are planning, and you are planning on continuing to work for most of that 4 years. So you have a very long horizon. You can afford to take on more risk. In other words, let's talk about basic allocations. Stocks are riskier than bonds. Bonds are a little more riskier than cash. Typically in a managed portfolio, which is what you will probably receive, or at least a mutual fund that is managed that way. If you are very young, you can look at a portfolio that's mostly stocks. Now, they tend to be more volatile, but they also will grow faster and longer. The term to keep in mind here is long term. You can start with that. And yes, I know what will happen if there's a downturn in the market. We know what happened last March. It went down 30%. But if you're in a pension plan, you're not going to go and change that allocation or sell out. You are looking at a horizon of 40 years. Now, what happens if you're a bit older than that? Let's say you're moving up. So maybe you're 30, 35, maybe just under 40. You might now have other obligations. You may be in a relationship or a marriage. You may have children. So your time in the workforce is still very long, just not as long as the 20 to 25-year-old. And you've got other liabilities. So looking at a very heavy stock market allocation to just stocks is going to cause you more stress. So you're going to be thinking about dropping that down so that you have an allocation that, let's say, is maybe 60% to 70% in stocks and almost the rest in some type of fixed income, high grade bonds, let's call them US Treasuries, and a little bit in cash. You're not going to have as large a return. You're also not going to have as much stress watching the volatility of that pension.
I think the pension, you talked about the pension administrator there, and I mean, I think you're referring to like the basket of mutual funds. So typically, a pension would be in mutual funds. Your contributions and the employer contributions, if there are any, will be going into mutual funds. And I think it would be fair to say that the pension administrator would be bringing, if you wish, a basket of mutual funds to any presentations, for example, so that when you, the individual, when you are deciding or choosing which mutual fund to go into, the pension administrator will say, okay, we've got 4 or 5 in, let's call it high risk, and then we've got 4 or 5 in middle risk, if you call it as such, and then you go 4 or 5 in low risk. So it's not an open-ended basket. In other words, it's not, there are hundreds and thousands, tens of thousands of mutual funds around the world. That pension administrator who was chosen by your employer will only be bringing, I don't know, 10, 15, 20. So it does make the choosing side of it a little bit easier, I would think, Martha, rather than you having to jump in yourself and say, well, I don't even know where to start. And I understand risk and I understand what you're telling me, but there's so many mutual. That doesn't apply because you're only being given a select choice of mutual funds within the basket, right?
That is very true. And when you're getting into the business of pensions and pension administrators and pension portfolio managers, there is a real element of fiduciary care that comes into place. So typically there will be a representative in most firms, I can't say all, things vary across the spectrum, that will work with you to figure out how comfortable you are with investment markets. And typically also you will see when the offerings are set up, one will say capital aggressive, one will say moderate, one will say balanced. Balance is probably the most popular of all because it does not become as volatile, and it tends to be much more on a steady basis going forward. Now, some companies, depending again where you live, may actually give all of the cash to 1 or 2 very large pension investment managers who will manage an overall, but again, overall allocation for each type of individuals. They may, again, offer 4 types: aggressive, moderate, balanced, and very conservative. So it tends to really kind of go along with your age and where your life stage is. We can't get into how sometimes people who are almost ready to retire can still keep money in a very aggressive portfolio allocation. But generally what will happen is as you progress through those work stages, you're going to pull back on the aggressive component of either the mutual funds or the portfolio management because you're getting closer to getting out of the workforce, and you do not have the time, if you decided to stay in an aggressive fund, and the time you decide to get out of your job and move into a semi-retirement or working for yourself situation, you will not have the time to let those assets recoup if you need to cash out then. So that it's really that ladder that you think about. You're going up the ladder, and when you get to that certain point, let's say you're now 58 to around 65 and thinking of cutting back, you're going to be going back down the ladder to much more conservative allocations so that you can maintain the balance that you've got in that pension portfolio, and it will be there for you when you have to make a decision to then retire and possibly change the composition of the portfolio altogether.
Yeah, so really you're saying then, as a rule of thumb, perhaps, that the older you get, the risk profile should be changing, and you should be essentially reducing your risk and going into sort of more conservative types of mutual fund. Now we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I think in a future episode, Martha, I'd like to talk about the payout side, taking annuity drawdowns, whatever, but not this session. So I would sort of try and finish off by saying, over and above your mandatory or your statutory or whatever word you want to use contributions, you've also got the opportunity in most pension plans for voluntary contributions. Now, we like voluntary contributions. I know you like voluntary contributions. So just give us a little bit of understanding of what is a voluntary contribution, why you would use it.
A voluntary contribution is on top of whatever the allocations are. Now, in this particular case, we're talking at 10%, 5% from you, 5% from your employer. Now, if you want to make a voluntary contribution, you could top on to that, let's say another 1 to 2%. It doesn't sound like much, but over 40 years, you have no idea. So if you put that on top, it doesn't meet quite the same format and choices at the end of your working life, where you're now ready to turn your pension into an annuity or some type of a drawdown account. Because it's a voluntary component of the pension that you started with, the rule and the contract law that goes with the regular pension does not apply. And you can actually withdraw that entire voluntary contribution without any type of a penalty. Now, I have seen where people have done that, and when they got to close to retirement, they had enough in the voluntary contribution portion to pay off their mortgage. So there's something to read.
Yeah. So I think we both like the voluntary contributions. So as I say, next time around we'll come on to payouts, etc. So you've been listening to Martha Harris Myron in our new series, Leaders in Action. Looking ahead, I hope you'll join us again soon. So for the time being, take care and bye, everyone.